Welcome to this class on sexual orientation and gender identity in international human rights law. My name is Tomás Vial and I am a law professor at the Diego Portales Law School and a researcher at his Human Rights Center. Some of the terms used by the international conventions, human rights reports and court decisions, such as gay or trans, were present in Section 2 of this course. Please go back to them if you need a proper background. Here, I shall refer to the way in which international legal sources have acknowledged and defined them. After referring to the general principles underlying this area of the law, I shall mention the situation in the main international and regional systems for protections of human rights, including the UN system, the European system, the Inter-American system, and the African system. The starting point of the current terminology on sexual orientation and gender identity are the Yogyakarta Principles of 2006. These principles are not binding. However, they have become the common standard accepted and used by the international human rights system. This is important because once they have been adopted by human rights courts or committees, they become part of the law and therefore create a number of legal obligations. Among them is the obligation to recognize the diversity of sexual orientation and gender identities in domestic legislation, public policies, and administrative practices. This implies to ensure the application of the principle of non-discrimination in cases where sexual orientation and gender identity are sources of discrimination. It also implies to prevent, investigate, punish, and compensate in cases of violence against people for their sexual orientation or gender identity. Furthermore, they educate citizens for the respect and recognition of the difference of orientations and genders. I shall explain how this concept has been recognized by the universal human rights system, as well as in the Inter-American, the European, and the African regional system for the protection of human rights. This recognition has been linked to a prohibition against discrimination and to the physical and psychological violence against people due to the real or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity. A number of United Nations treaties and resolutions recognize sexual orientation and gender identity as a legal terms. Perhaps the first such acknowledgement was the 1994 decision of the Human Rights Committee, the organ in charge of interpreting and deciding complaints of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights in the Tunen versus Australia case, that states have an obligation to protect people against discrimination for reasons of sexual orientation. That decision was followed by others in the same vein, such a decision against Colombia and some observations emitted in country reports by the same committee. Later on, a number of other UN organs, such as the Committee on Social and Economic Rights, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, or the Committee Against Torture, have produced reports or documents, such as the General Commentaries, where they state that the rights recognized in those treaties also apply to people of any sexual orientation or gender identity. An example is the General Observation number 20 of the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Committee of 2009, which states that the term other status contained in Article 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which prohibit discrimination, includes sexual orientations and gender identity. Furthermore, The general observation explicitly makes a reference to the Yogyakarta principles in order to define those terms. In July of 2011, the Human Rights Council, the maximum organ of the UN human rights system, emitted its first official declaration regretting discrimination and violence against people for their sexual orientation and gender identity. The resolution asks the High Commissioner on Human Rights to write a report on laws and practice that discriminate and acts of violence against them. The 2011 and 2015 report state that all gays, lesbian, bisexuals and trans people should enjoy the protection of human rights norms. In the European human rights system, the main source of decision is the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. The first decision of the European Court on this matter were on cases of criminalization of same-sex relations. In the 1981, in the Dow versus United Kingdom case, the court stated that the total prohibition of those relations was an infraction of the right to private life, recognized in Article 8 of the European Human Rights Convention. Later, in 2003, in the LVV versus Austria case, the court explicitly affirmed that sexual orientation is a concept covered by the Article 14 of the Convention, the clause against discrimination. In terms of the right to a gender identity, the European Court started in 1992 with the decision on the V versus France case, a long and consistent line of rulings deciding that the lack of recognition or discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity were violations of the European Convention. In the PV versus Spain case of 2010, the court explicitly stated that transsexuality is covered by Article 14 of the European Human Rights Convention. In 1981, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted the first recommendation, number 924, condemning discrimination against homosexuals. Later, in 2000, it argued that sexual orientation shall be included among the grounds of discrimination. In the Inter-American system, both the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and the General Assembly of the Organization of American States have explicitly and consistently recognized sexual orientation and gender identity as a category covered by the prohibition of discrimination. Perhaps the most important decision in this line was the 2012 sentence of the Inter-American Court in the Atala versus Chile case that explicitly stated that the prohibition of discrimination provided in Article 2 of the Convention applied to sexual orientation and gender identity. Previously, and since 2008, the General Assembly of the Organization of American States had emitted a declaration condemning discrimination against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. In 2012, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights published a report on concepts and standards related to sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. What is relevant here is that the report basically follows the Yogyakarta principles in order to understand these terms. More recently, the 2014 Inter-American Convention Against Discrimination and All Forms of Intolerance explicitly included the prohibition of discrimination for reasons of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. Finally, in 2014, The African Commission on Human Rights and People Rights issued a declaration condemning violence and other human rights violations against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. As it might be seen, sexual orientation, gender identity, and also gender expression have become binding legal categories, imposing obligations to the state to respect and protect people falling within them. It is clear also that such process of recognition and protection is linked to a fight against discrimination all over the world. For that reason, it is recommended to watch the class on discrimination of this course. Thanks for watching this class. Please visit our website moogchile.com.